This video tutorial is brought to you by tipsquirrel.com, home of the best Photoshop and Lightroom tips on the web. Follow @tipsquirrel on Twitter or go to facebook.com/tipsquirrel. Hi everybody, Mike Hoffman here, and today we're going to be looking at Perspective Warp, a brand new feature in Photoshop CC just released by Adobe. And this new feature is available only in Photoshop CC. So if you're still using Photoshop CS6, I'm sorry, but you won't be able to follow along with this tutorial. It often happens when we're compositing images that we end up with two different images from different vantage points. In this case, we have this automobile and I want to place it on this background. But in this case, the automobile was taken from a slightly different angle and a slightly different perspective from the background image, and it's enough to be distracting. In fact, I've created some vanishing point lines on another layer just so we can see how far off this image is. And sure enough, it really doesn't blend in very well. But the new feature in Photoshop CC, Perspective Warp, will allow us to quickly and easily work with this type of issue and stretch and shape our images in a fairly automated way. As you've seen, I'm working with this car on its own layer. And with that layer selected, I'm simply going to choose Edit, and then I'll choose the new Perspective Warp command. We get a short video that kind of shows us what we need to do. And we can dismiss that if we want, or we can leave it there. I'll just leave it there. But what we're going to do is we're going to drag out two planes, one for the front of the automobile and one for the side of the automobile. So I'm going to start right about here in the corner and drag out a plane here, and you can see what's happening. As I drag, I'm getting a rectangular grid. And once I let go, that grid drops into place. And now I've got to drop the grid in for the side. And so I'll start back here in the back of the car and bring it forward. And you can see as I get close to the other grid, the vertical lines highlight in a blue color. And when I let go, they snap together. And there's my perspective grid. Now it's not expected that we're going to get this right in the first try, so we can simply hover over any of the corner points and adjust them as need be. Now we want this vertical line here to be right about on the corner of the car, so that the entire front of the car is on this face and the side of the car is on this face. So we can move this from side to side and we'll position it right about there. Now we've got to work these lines going into the background so that they line up with the body of the automobile. So we'll put this one about right there, and we'll take this one about right there. Now if I click this vertical line on the back of the grid and drag it around, you can see it's as if I'm swinging this grid around. But if I've got it lined up the way that I want, and I just want it to go backwards into space a little bit more, I can hold the Shift key down. When I hold the Shift key down and drag, you can see that actually extends the grid. So we want this grid to include all of the automobile that we want to warp. Now we've got the same issue here on the bottom. We haven't encompassed all of the tires. So I'm going to shift and drag this downward to make sure that we've got the tires selected. Now at this point, the lines are not quite lining up. So we can move this lower right corner a little bit. And now we've got these lines pretty well in line. Let's look at the front of the automobile. Here we can drag this down just a little bit, move it out so that it covers the entire front of the car. And we'll do the same down here. And I'm looking at the lines here to make sure that they line up with the features of the automobile. So we'll drag this down a little bit. And that looks pretty good right about there. So now we can see the problem. This perspective grid doesn't match up in any way with the perspective lines in the background image. But once we've placed this grid on the image that we want to warp, we can change from the layout mode to the warp mode. And when we do now, we can move the warp pins around to manipulate the image. And it's as easy as simply dragging any of the corner pins, and you can see that we've got a pretty free-form warp available to us. Now we don't want to go too crazy here, but what we want to do is line up the front of the car so it matches this perspective line, and then line up the back of the car so it looks like it's receding into this image a little more naturally. Now, one thing that we can do is to shift click on any one of these lines, and that holds it at a vertical orientation. And then as we drag the pin, you can see that that vertical line is moving right along with the pin as I move it. So we'll drag it in here a little bit, not too far. Again, we don't want to get too crazy with this. But now we'll look at the back of the car. And we'll drag this over a little bit, and we want to line this up again with the perspective lines a little more naturally. Careful, because a little bit goes a long way. And once we have the car looking fairly natural, we can once again shift click on the vertical, and then we can drag it and move it around like so. So that's looking pretty good. The front is a little bit too big. We'll move this down a bit. And that's looking pretty good right there. Now keep in mind that we're in the warp mode, but we can always go back to the layout mode. And when we do, we once again see our original layout grids, and we can make some modifications. So if we miss part of the image, we can switch back and forth between layout and warp mode. But once we're done, we can click on the check mark, and now the warp is applied. And now we can look at the before and the after, and we can see that we've made a pretty astounding change in the perspective of this car as we've applied the perspective warp. Some images will work better than others. You'll have to give it a try and experiment for yourself, and you may not get everything exactly right. For example, these tires are looking a little bit out of shape, and we might need to go back and do a little touch-up work on the tires. But as a whole, we've been able to blend this car in a little bit more accurately with the perspective lines in the image that we're trying to composite. Give this a try yourself. I'm sure you can come up with lots of uses for this brand new tool in Adobe Photoshop CC. My name is Mike Hoffman. My website is hoffmanartdesign.com. You'll find a variety of Photoshop, Lightroom, and photography tips and tricks and related information there. You can follow me on Twitter at mhoffman2001, and you can find me on Google Plus by simply going to g+mikehoffman.com. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed today's tutorial.